Hello, welcome to the University of Law. In today's video, I'm going to be going through my Time War theory and what I believe is phase one of the Time War, the first chapter of Time War storytelling at Big Finish Productions. Now, the obvious one to start with is going to have to be the second War Master box set, The Master of Callus, simply because it very clearly takes place on the eve of war. War hasn't been declared yet. The War Master is undercover doing a job for Narvin. The war has yet to begin and he's doing some undercover work, so it's set just before the war begins. So that's clearly the very first story in phase one, the War Master, the Master of Callus. Now what we have next is this box set here, which is the very first Gallifrey Time War. Oh, and let me just say, the War Master Volume 1 we'll go through later is a complex one. It's a little bit timey-wimey. It will crop up throughout different phases, but essentially after they've done the first volume 2, 3, 4 and onwards, there's a little bit more of an order to them, but they're kind of set in and around box set 1, but certainly 2, 3 and 4 definitely take place before 1, and we'll go into that at the very end of this video. So we've got volume 2 is the first story of the first phase, which I call Antigenesis, and you'll find out why in a minute. So then we've got the Gallifrey Time War Volume 1. Now, this box set, and the whole box set doesn't take place in phase 1. It's just the first two stories, which are Celestial Intervention, which sees the very beginning of the war, so it goes from being a Cold War to being a full-on war, and also Celestial Intervention, which is Celestial Intervention is the first one, and then Soldier Obscura is set immediately afterwards, and it's the first story where we get an inkling for the fact that the Doctor is aware of the war and is refusing to fight. So the Doctor's been made aware of the war, he knows about it. That could be important later, I'm going to go through that in a minute. But he's aware of the war, he's refusing to fight, so they have to call for the War Master, but he has gone missing. So after the Master of Callus, and that ended with the War Master, and the spoilers here, it ends with him in payment for what he's done for the Time Lords in the prelude to war. He has been given a fob watch, which we all know what he's going to do with later in Utopia. But he then goes into hiding, and they're trying to find. They've resurrected him, as we saw in Ravenous. They resurrected him. They brought him back to fight a time war, but he doesn't want that. He's gone into hiding. They can't use the Doctor's help, so they need the Master, and they search for him. So, with that aside, those two stories come next. So we've had the Master of Callus, we've had Celestial Intervention, and we've had Soldier Obscura. Next up, we then have this trilogy here. So we take a little sidestep. So while they're looking for the Master, not much is happening. The war is kind of starting to branch out across the cosmos. And we have these three. We've got the Rulers of the Universe, we've got the Sontaran Ordeal, and we've got Day of the Vashta Narada. So essentially what's happening here is the war is starting to kind of spread across the universe. We're kind of seeing in each story that ordinary people's lives are being ruined. The war arrives from nowhere, and suddenly a planet that is peaceful has its last few centuries rewritten into a horrible period of bloodshed. And the Eighth Doctor's just trying to have fun. He's just trying to explore the universe. But wherever he goes, the Time War keeps catching up with him. So that's a nice little trilogy. We're seeing the war branching out. We're seeing that horror begin. The War Master's still nowhere to be seen. Now, why have I put these three first and not the Eighth Doctor Time War range? Because a lot of people will kind of interpret that first story, the Search for Theseus, as being his first story with the Time War. Well, at the start of the story, he's having an ordinary life, and suddenly the war catches up with him, and suddenly he remembers everything. And to me, that indicates that you could. It's meant to be ambiguous anyway, but you can clearly argue there that actually once the war catches up with him, he remembers it all, and he was aware of it already. Also, and we'll go through this with later ranges, there is clear evidence that the Eighth Doctor Time War range is set after Rassilon's resurrection, whereas there are stories featuring the Eighth Doctor which are clearly set before Rassilon's resurrection, which featured the Eighth Doctor on his own. So clearly there was a period in the Time War where he travelled without Bliss before the Time War range. And although these three, it's ambiguous as to when they're set, I think the fact that he could have had adventures on his own in the Time War before Bliss came along suggests that we might as well place these with those. And since they're the first three Eighth Doctor Time War releases, and again, as a rule, I tend to say things if it's released if it's in release order, it tends to be chronological order. I'm placing those here. Now, eventually, we managed to catch up with the War Master in Unit Cyber Reality. He's been hiding between universes, and he's now ready to return to the fold. He's ready to return to the Time War. So that's a nice little story where we see the War Master return. So that's the next one. So with him now back in the fray, we have these two releases which are connected. We've got his appearance in River Song, which links into Rage of the Time Lords. So this box set clearly takes place before Rassilon's resurrection, because it takes place before Antigenesis, which takes place before, and this is where it gets confusing now, which takes place before Beneath the Viscoid, which takes place in advance of Rassilon's resurrection, because it takes place before the finale of Gallifrey Time War 1. It's all very confusing, but basically the Eighth Doctor definitely was travelling on his own before Rassilon's resurrection, whereas in Time War 1, where he meets Bliss for the first time and he's alone at the start, when he meets from later box, that's because they're chronological, we found out that Rassilon has been resurrected by this point. There's references to Susan's War as well, which means it's after Rassilon, which clearly means that before Time War 1, he was on his own and he was aware of the war, which is why I've put that trilogy here as well. So these stories here take place straight after Master of Worlds. So far, what you can see with the pattern here is that a lot of these releases are focused on the War Master. So what we're seeing the dawn of the war. We're seeing Gallifrey pretty much as we know it. We're seeing Narvin and Romana, Ace, Leela. It's the crew that we know, and the Daleks are essentially as we know them at this stage. But slowly, things are starting to change. Things are getting worse. They've had to resort to the War Master because the Doctor will not get involved. But the War Master, you can see throughout this reign, throughout the series, although he's helping them, he's got his own interests at heart. He really is using the war to his own advantage. And that comes to a head in the last story. And this is the epic climax to the first phase, Antigenesis. And I've named this phase after Antigenesis because it seems that the whole first chapter of the war is about, the fact that it started at the genesis of the Daleks, and that whole kind of regret about previous actions on both sides and what it's led to, and if only we could kind of go back and change things. And this is his ultimate chance to try and change things. It's an epic story, and it's a nice little round off to a phase that essentially is bookended by the War Master, because it goes from the Master of Callus to Antigenesis. So the main theme of this is it's all about the early days of the war. It's about how many of the Time Lords transition to a new way of doing things, and how the universe slowly changes from one state of affairs to the war. So it's kind of a slow burner. It takes you those very early, weeks, months of the war. And it ends with Antigenesis with a cliffhanger that leads directly into phase 2, which I will be going over in my next video. But what do you think? Any thoughts on how I've placed things? Anything you agree with? Anything you disagree with? Anything that you'd add? Let me know in the comments below. And to make sure you watch that next video, part 2 on phase 2, don't forget to like and subscribe. As always, I look forward to speaking to you soon.